1933, a bill to require the Department of Health to provide certain information related to Lyme disease on its website. Passed the House February 5th, passed the Senate with a substitute on the 18th.
The gentlewoman from Fairfax, Mrs. Comstock.
Mr. Speaker, I would ask the body to accept the Senate substitute. What this bill is about and what the substitute does, it requires disclosure of information to Lyme patients about the testing that is available currently. Right now, their current laboratory testing is highly inaccurate. It's known, but often patients don't know it. We had extensive testimony, and we have people here in the gallery today who were told that they did not have Lyme disease after their first test, and then they went on for months and years, and even in some cases decades, to suffer with this disease because of the inaccuracy of the test. What this disclosure requires to tell them about the false negatives of the test, and so we can change today their ability to get that information and be able to know that the testing is inaccurate, and they might, if the symptoms persist, need to get additional testing. So I'd hope it would be the pleasure of the body to accept the Senate substitute.
The gentleman from Fairfax, Mr. Hugo.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to speak to the measure.
The gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I agree with this gentleman. The Lyme disease is an insidious disease, and it impacts people the way we live, impacts our jobs, and it impacts people and leaves them permanently debilitated. In areas like mine and others, it's insidious. It's all over. I have 4 kids, and I have a little creek through the backyard. The 2 older kids could play in the creek a few years ago. 2 younger kids will never be able to do it because every night when we go to bed, we have to give the kids a head-to-toe tick check, just like all of our neighbors. If you go down my street, every one of my neighbors, somebody in their house has had Lyme disease over the years. It impacts our friends. My friend Delegate Albo and I have a friend of ours, Richard Gardner. He's a great lawyer, most compassionate part-time judge you'll ever meet. Last year, I talked to his wife. He was closing down his law practice. They couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. He had taken the Lyme disease test, negative. Come back, he had gone through every other test. He was going through doctors all over the country. Couldn't figure it out. Circled back to the doctor. He said, let's try one more time. Let's give you the Lyme disease protocol. He was out of work. 2 weeks later, he's back to work. It's something they are missing. But it's all can leave, he's the lucky one. It can leave people permanently debilitated. Got a friend of mine from college, Robin Roughton. Her sister, Lucy, had been diagnosed with MS and other diseases, misdiagnosed. She had had the Lyme disease test. The lady was in a wheelchair. For years and years and years, she had problems. They thought it was chronic fatigue, MS, pick your disease. They couldn't figure it out. She took the Lyme disease protocol, and now she's trying to live a normal life, but she's still got problems, still debilitated, she says. But she's trying to live a normal life. What the gentlelady's motion will do was move us forward, help some of our people, because you see, I've given you 3 little vignettes, but Lyme disease, it's not anecdotal for a lot of us. It's an epidemic. I hope you'll support the resolution and accept the Senate amendments. Thank you.
The gentleman from Caroline, Mr. Orrock.
Mr. Speaker, speaking to the motion.
The gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, let's be clear. First and foremost, if you look at the matter before the body right now, it's not whether we think that Lyme disease is a problem. It's not whether we think we need to do something. The matter before the body right now is which 2 versions of the language do we feel will better address the critical and real needs of the citizenry of the Commonwealth to be informed about this disease and have the physician community become educated about the disease. Now, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, you need to also understand that what we're being asked to accept at this juncture is the very language that the House Health, Welfare, and Institutions Subcommittee rejected after a more than 1 hour long presentation one evening, then was heard again to some measure in full committee, at which point in full committee I don't recall any opposition speaking opposed to the language we adopted earlier, which is what you will see in the Senate substitute. I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, turn wrong, to the engrossed version. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, read the language. In what we're being asked to accept here today, to paraphrase, it's basically being said that every time a patient is going to be given a test for Lyme disease, they're going to be given a piece of paper that says, oh, by the way, this test may not mean anything. So good luck with that and go and ask some more questions. If you look at what I would consider to be the more thoughtful language of the engrossed bill, yes, it's only posting it on a website. But if you read that language, you will see it as a more measured statement addressing truly what the patient should recognize. And I would suggest even more important, read the second enactment clause of the engrossed bill, which is not a part of what we're being asked to agree to right now. And that second enactment clause charges the Department of Health with giving information to the entire medical community about the problems of the testing and encouraging them to share that information on that one-on-one patient counseling time, so they're not just given a black and white piece of paper saying you're going to get a test, may or may not mean anything, if you have questions come back and see me. What it truly will mean is that the physician at the time says, I'm going to order a test, and there may be some problems. So I would suggest, in all due respect to the patron of the measure, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, we should reject the Senate substitute. I think the House got it right. It's not a question as to whether any of the 100 of us in this room recognize the problem of Lyme disease, because we do. It's a question of what is the better policy that we can effect to address the legitimate needs of folks who may or may not be suffering from that disease. I hope you will reject the Senate substitute.
The gentleman from Marico, Mr. O'Bannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speak to the measure.
The gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, sir. I hope that you will reject the Senate substitute, not only for the reasons that the gentleman from Caroline said, but we really did hear this. What you have here is two competing ways to get something done. I think we all recognize that Lyme disease is a terrible problem. It's an epidemic. It's getting worse. So the real goal here is to educate the public and the patients and the practitioners. But I would just remind you that your House version of this passed 93-5, including the gentlelady from Fairfax who voted for the House version. And so the way to move this ball down the court is to go ahead and reject the Senate version. Let's keep working on it, put it in a conference, and hopefully we'll get something that will satisfy more participants. So I hope you'll reject the Senate substitute.
The gentleman from Halifax, Mr. Edmonds.
Mr. Speaker, speaking the substitute.
The gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I don't often rise on this floor to speak to many measures, although I have my opinions. And I wasn't privy to the HWI discussions. And I supported the delegate's bill because it did a lot more than we have done in the past. However, had this been her bill, I would have supported this one. Mr. Speaker, I recognize there's a policy issue here. But I'm convinced that in 1988, my father died from untreated Lyme's disease. And he may be alive today if he had known that the test was inaccurate. He was diagnosed, Mr. Speaker, with first bulbar palsy, then ALS, and he continued to deteriorate. It took 3 years. 3 years. And if this measure can save one life, then I suggest that we support this measure and vote. I ask the House to support the Senate substitute.
Gentleman from Loudoun, Mr. Ramadan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Speaking of the bill.
Speaking of the bill.
Gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the gentleman from Halifax is absolutely right. If we can save one more life, it makes this bill worth it. Now, to correct a couple things and to clarify to the body. True, as the gentleman from Caroline mentioned, we are choosing between two languages, and we are doing something. But here's the difference. The language that came back from the Senate is the language that was the will of the patron, the language that was worked out with the state groups and the stakeholders, and the language that will help our constituents in Loudoun County and Fairfax, whereby we have the highest Lyme disease concentration in the nation. Further, Mr. Speaker, the difference is that this is a proactive language that will make a little bit of a difference versus a language that was adjusted that would just put a bill on the books that does nothing. I strongly urge the body to support the Senate amendments and the patron of the bill. Thank you.
The gentleman from Prince William, Mr. Marshall.
Speaking to the motion.
The gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hope my colleagues support the gentlelady's request. At one point in Prince William County, I personally knew more people with confirmed Lyme disease than the state of Virginia acknowledged in its public health reporting. This is vastly underreported, and the individuals are given a false sense of security because they are not alerted via a mandate. This is, I guess, kind of it's not a patient package insert, but it's a testing insert that we're telling the patients, you may or may not have received accurate information. So I think this is simply no different than a statement that you see elsewhere. This is not a confirmed diagnosis. This is just a cautionary statement. Be on guard because this disease has many symptoms or can be misdiagnosed many ways.
I'm going to ask the House to suspend temporarily. The gentleman from Hanover.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker, I've been directed by the President of the Senate to inform the House of Delegates that the Senate has agreed to your House Joint Resolution 970.
I would thank the gentleman. Gentleman from Virginia Beach, Mr. Stolley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to the Senate amendment.
Gentleman has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I would point out that folks here keep talking about the test. There's not the test. There are 5 separate tests for Lyme disease. The language in this bill speaks to one of those 5 tests. However, the way the bill is written, that the same information has to be given to the patients on all 5 of those tests. The standards here are not the same across the board. Not only that, this puts this into the code for 5 years. Medical knowledge changes very, very quickly. There are further tests in development right now. This does not give physicians the opportunity to give patients the most up-to-date information. We put the physicians in a position of having to tell the patient something that we know to be wrong. That is not the position that the General Assembly should take. We need to have flexibility, certainly set policy of what we'd like to do, but don't dictate to physicians how they communicate with their patients and how they educate the patients. Mr. Speaker, I would hope the body rejects this measure.
Gentleman from Loudoun, Mr. Minshew.
Good to speak to the bill.
Gentleman has the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen of the House, I would ask that we support the gentlelady from Fairfax acceptance of the Senate amendments. I speak as a scoutmaster from Loudoun County. I probably pulled more ticks off of boys than anyone in Loudoun County. And the problem with the current test for Lyme is that it gives too many false negatives. What this bill will do will allow those parents who have had their scoutmasters like me pull ticks off of boys know that a negative that comes back doesn't mean you don't have the disease. I would ask that we accept the Senate amendments.
Gentleman from Fairfax, Mr. Keene.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak to the measure.
Gentleman has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not an expert on health care. I certainly appreciate and respect the opinions of my colleagues who are medical doctors, but it seems to me just from a glance of this that we're talking about an either-or situation. Either we go with the House version, which would then require a lot of public relations and public affairs and information that to be available, or the Senate version, which actually takes that information and puts it in the hands of those that need that information. I wish there was a way that we can combine both, that we did both, and not just either or. But in the event, in the scenario that we face ourselves, which is a choice between taking the Senate version and taking the House version, I would hope that we all take the Senate version, because agreeing with some of my colleagues who spoke earlier, this is the information that we need to make sure that those that are victims of Lyme disease have, and not just the members of the general public. And I recognize a few of my constituents in the gallery as well who came down here to talk to us about this issue. I think we owe it to them to make sure that we get the information in their hands, and not just in the public at large. So I hope that we will accept the substitute.
Gentlewoman from Fairfax, Mrs. Comstock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to addressing the bill.
Gentlelady has the floor.
Nothing in this bill prevents public information and from doctors continuing to update their information and giving more information to their patients. And obviously that is something that would continue. We can also have information go up on the public websites too. Nothing in this bill, in the Senate substitute, would prevent that. We actually had letters sent out to physicians in the Commonwealth about this problem, but what the Senate substitute does that has not been done to date is it puts that information directly in the hands of the patients. If you're told you don't have, when you get your test, that it's negative and you don't have Lyme disease, you're not going to go start looking on a website to find out what's going, what might be on a website. You've been told you don't have it. So all this is saying is it's a very simple disclosure in the language that was both going to be in the House version and now in the Senate substitute was merely informing people, getting that information directly to the patients. The Senate substitute does that much better by directly letting the patient know that there is false negatives here. The doctors can always give their patients all the additional information that they want to provide. This is just providing them something that's actually on the lab results themselves. We had patients who showed us their lab results, which shows the doctor gets the lab results saying that this test isn't reliable. So watch this and know. So all we're asking is the information the doctors get from the labs, that be directly given to the patient, because that is the best way to get the information directly into their hands. So I hope it's the pleasure of the body to adopt the Senate substitute.
Gentleman from Powhatan, Mr. Ware.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I have a motion.
Gentleman may state it.
I move the pending question.
Gentleman moves the pending question. All those in favor of that motion signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The pending question is moved. Shall the Senate substitute be adopted? Clerk, close the roll.
Ayes 56, noes 40.